Scipio Africanus, who was destined to become a towering figure in Roman history. In the lineage of truly great Romans, the short list begins with Romulus, passes to Camillus, and then passes to Scipio, perhaps the greatest of them all. It was not until Julius Caesar 250 years later that Rome would again see a man with the stature of Scipio Africanus. Now, of course, he was not called Scipio Africanus at this point. He was still simply Publius Scipio, son of Publius Scipio the Elder. He would not earn the cognomen Africanus until after he returned from Zama, having won the Second Punic, but that was still a ways in the future. At this point, he was an untested youth of barely 25, who impetuously stepped forward into the Senate and offered to take up the command in Spain if nobody else would. The Senate was not crazy about the idea, but under the circumstances they figured they had nothing to lose. It was essentially take a chance on Scipio or admit defeat in Spain. So to Scipio went the command. Now, it was not just his youth that worried the old Roman guard, but the personality of Scipio in particular. Old warhorses like Fabius did not like the look of young Scipio one bit. For one thing, he had, horror of horrors, long hair like a woman. For another thing, he had a distressing habit of talking as if he personally spoke to the gods and was acting on their behalf. In later years, he would often return from long strolls and announce battle plans as if they had been given to him by Mars himself. Finally, and most troublesome of all to the keepers of tradition Scipio seemed to delight in flouting. He was enormously charismatic. Scipio represented a changing of the guard, and despite his success, or perhaps because of it, he was looked upon with real fear by his elders. He was an incredibly magnetic cross between Jim Morrison, Alexander the Great, and Jesus. For those looking to keep things exactly as they are, a figure like that leads to many a sleepless night. But Scipio's flouting of tradition was the key to his success. He and old Fabius agreed on one thing, however. The Roman legions, presently constituted, were no match for the Carthaginians. But where Fabius read this to mean the Carthaginians should not be fought directly, Scipio read it to mean that the Romans had to fundamentally alter their tactics. Hannibal beat the Romans over and over again with cunning and imagination. So where the Romans had previously shown nothing but uninspired plotting, Scipio hoped to give the Carthaginians a taste of their own medicine and outthink his opponents rather than simply try and outfight them. He arrived in Spain with 10,000 men in 210 BC with vague instructions to regain lost Roman territory. But Scipio had no intention of simply fighting a defensive war. His long-term goal was to end the war completely and saw Spain as his proving ground. If he succeeded here, the Senate might offer him overall command of the legions and allow him to pursue his real dream of invading North Africa and conquering Carthage. There was no way he could convince the conservative Senate today, but if he drove the Carthaginians out of Spain, he just might gain their ear. After spending his first year in Spain getting a feel for the land and the locals, he embarked on an audacious assault of the largest, strongest, and richest of the Carthaginian strongholds, New Carthage. The 3 Carthaginian armies still out in the field had no idea the new Roman commander would attempt such a suicidal move. But the element of surprise was the element Scipio coveted most, and so he did the last thing anybody would expect of him, and ordered his army to march on New Carthage. Not even his subordinate commanders knew their true destination. The only other Roman who was in on the plan was a close Scipio confidant named Laelius, who commanded the Roman navy in the area. He was ordered to make for New Carthage and simultaneously attack from sea as Scipio engaged from the land. The small garrison at New Carthage was shocked when the Roman navy appeared on the horizon, and was doubly shocked when a Roman army came marching over the hill. The nearest Carthaginian army was days away, more than enough time, Scipio felt, to take the city and fortify it before reinforcements could arrive. He attempted a direct assault on the first day, but was repelled. That night, he received a critical piece of intelligence. A local pointed out that at certain times during the day, the lagoon that bordered one of the walls of the city drained out with the tides and became shallow enough to ford. The next morning, Scipio ordered a full assault on the front gate, and the defenders of the city concentrated all their attention on that spot. Scipio himself led a small contingent through the shallow and unwatched lagoon and scaled the walls. They easily overpowered what resistance they found, and when the Romans suddenly appeared behind the troops defending the wall, the Carthaginians panicked and broke for the citadel, allowing Scipio to open the gate and let the rest of his army in. It was only a matter of time before the unprovisioned force in the citadel was forced to surrender. In about 36 hours, Scipio had captured the Carthaginian capital. In a savvy move designed to gain Spanish support, Scipio released the members of the various local ruling families who had been held by the Carthaginians as hostages. By this one act alone, Scipio did more for the Roman position in Spain than all the battles in the world ever could. The Carthaginians were immediately on the defensive and found their Spanish allies deserting in droves. But Scipio, as I said, had no intention of staying put and fighting a defensive war. Leaving a garrison behind to protect the newly conquered city, he marched out with the rest of his army in search of Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother and the architect of the Scipio's family dishonor. In 208 BC, Scipio caught up to Hasdrubal and fought a running battle against the Carthaginians in the middle of Spain. Hasdrubal, however, managed to slip away and lead his army northwest to the Atlantic coast. Hannibal's brother had decided fighting young Scipio in Spain would be counterproductive, and made the decision to leave Spain for Italy. The best way to regain the upper hand in Spain, he figured, was to deal the Romans another crushing blow in Italy. But that was the plan hatched between the two Barca brothers. The Carthaginian Senate, on the other hand, was not ready to cede Spain to Scipio quite so easily, and sent 50,000 reinforcements to defeat the young, dynamic Roman general. In 206 BC, the two sides met near Elypia. The battle that followed would be, tactically at least, Scipio's finest hour. Outnumbering the Romans by a sizable margin, the Carthaginians were confident they could beat the so far undefeated Scipio. But the Roman general, taking a page from Hannibal's playbook, employed a clever trick that turned a long-shot win into an easy victory. The two sides would line up for battle and wait for the other to make a move, and each day neither would budge and the day would pass without a battle. When Scipio deployed his troops, he concentrated the core of the legions in the center and placed his Spanish allies on the wings. The opposing Carthaginian general got used to this formation and placed his strongest troops in the center and his own weaker Spanish mercenaries on the wings. On the morning Scipio had decided to fight, however, he switched things up. But first, he took revenge on the Carthaginians for the Roman defeat at Trebia, a battle Scipio was very likely at. He ordered out his cavalry early in the morning to attack the Carthaginian camp. In a reverse of the previous battle, this time it was the Carthaginians who were roused from their beds and forced to charge out without a good breakfast. They formed for battle in the usual line, but the Romans, as I said, switched things up. Scipio put the Spanish in the center and deployed the legions on the wings. When the Carthaginian general did not notice the switch, Scipio knew victory was his for the taking. He waited most of the day while the Carthaginians suffered, hungry and tired, under the hot afternoon sun, and then ordered the attack. The Roman wings led the charge, easily destroying the overmatched opposing Spanish wings. The Libyans and Carthaginians at the center of the other army suddenly found themselves flanked on both sides by the Romans. In the confusion, they didn't even charge forward to attack the Roman center, made up of the weak Spanish mercenaries, where they may have won an escape route. Instead, they stayed put and were caught in a pincer. The only thing that saved them was that the weather turned ugly and rain turned the field into a mud-clogged morass. The Carthaginians were able to escape, but their will was broken. Hannibal pursued the fleeing army and destroyed them a few weeks later. When Scipio entered Spain, the Carthaginians controlled practically the entire country. But now the Romans were the undisputed masters. Carthaginian influence in Spain was over, and in a few years hence, the Great War itself would be over as well. Scipio now had all the clout he needed to take his master plan to the Senate. There would be fierce resistance for his idea of an African invasion, but Scipio's charisma and track record would carry the day. Next week, we will follow Hasdrubal in his desperate effort to link up with his brother in Italy and form an army large enough to attack Rome. I don't think I'll be giving anything away by revealing Hasdrubal was stopped in the last pivotal battle of the war fought in Italy. Without hope of reinforcement, Hannibal's decade-long invasion would run out of steam, and he would be recalled when the Romans decided to take another chance on Scipio and authorize his invasion of Africa. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 23E, The War with Hannibal. Though neither side was aware of it, the long war between Rome and Carthage was marching inexorably towards a final conclusion. For the Romans, the scourge of Hannibal seemed a virus they would never be able to purge from their bodies. Not strong enough to conquer the Romans, yet too strong to just be driven off, Hannibal had wreaked havoc in Italy for a decade, and there was no indication he would ever leave. The Fabian strategy of countering Hannibal's political moves without risking open battle was by now firmly entrenched. Even those commanders who broke from this tradition found themselves chasing after a ghost. Hannibal would never fight a battle not of his own devising, and stayed forever one step ahead of Roman pursuit. Hannibal himself knew that things could not go on like this forever. The Carthaginian Senate was growing weary of the war. Supplies and reinforcements were produced in ever-shrinking amounts after ever more cajoling. If things kept going in this direction, Hannibal would find himself isolated in enemy territory, abandoned by his country. It was fast turning into a replay of his father's war in Sicily. Hannibal could see the writing on the wall. He did not have the money or manpower to launch a decisive offensive, even if the shell-shocked Romans still went to bed in fear of the Carthaginian army pouring through the gates while they slept. But entering 207 BC, the 11th year since Hannibal had left New Carthage for Italy, the Carthaginian commander still had hope of a successful conclusion. His brother Hasdrubal had left Spain after tangling with young Scipio, and was making his way across Gaul through the Alps, and would soon be in Italy with an army of 30,000. If the two brothers were able to link up, they would form an army that could overrun anything the Romans sent against them. The Romans were not ignorant of the threat they faced from the second invading army. When Hasdrubal passed into the Po Valley, he was immediately shadowed by two Roman legions, led by one of the consuls for the year, Marcus Livius. Livius kept to the high ground, not having enough troops to openly confront Hasdrubal, but hoping to at least forestall the Carthaginians if they attempted to move further south. Hasdrubal, knowing there was no army in the area who could match him, moved confidently through the Italian countryside, picking up Gallic allies and waiting for word from his brother on where to meet up. The other consul for the year, Gaius Claudius Nero, was encamped with his army some 250 miles south, keeping watch on Hannibal.